There exists within consciousness a peculiar suspicion, not of the world, but of the languages inherited to describe it. The modern seeker encounters ancient texts and finds them labyrinthine, deliberately obscure, resistant to immediate comprehension. This resistance is dismissed as cultural distance or deliberately protective esotericism, yet neither explanation suffices. The complexity of ancient wisdom was never ornamental. It was structural necessity. The Hermetic schools of Alexandria did not encode their teachings to exclude the uninitiated. They encoded them because the realities being described could not survive translation into simpler forms. To simplify the doctrine of the threefold soul would not make it accessible, it would render it false. The Gnostic texts that speak of archons and aeons are not mythologizing psychology. They are mapping territories of consciousness that possess their own topology, their own laws of motion. The Kabbalistic doctrine of the Sephiroth is not a diagram of divine emanation alone, but a precise schematic of how consciousness itself is structured across multiple simultaneous registers of being. What appears as complexity to the casual reader is experienced as precision by the practitioner. The initiatic traditions of late antiquity, Neoplatonic, Hermetic, and Proto-Kabbalistic, operated on a shared understanding that the soul possesses distinct levels, each governed by different principles, each requiring different approaches. To address the soul as a unified field is to miss its fundamental architecture. The Nefesh, the animal soul bound to bodily existence, cannot be transformed through the same operations that awaken Neshamah, the supernal intellect that participates in divine thought. To treat them as one is to guarantee failure. The central problem, then, is not that ancient wisdom is difficult. It is that consciousness itself is not simple. The soul is not a substance but a structure, a hierarchy of functions, each mediating between levels above and below. To know this structure is not to gain power over it, but to recognize where one stands within it. The forgotten science of the soul was never meant to produce results. It was meant to produce precision. Every authentic metaphysical system that has survived antiquity preserves a threefold division at its core. This is not coincidence, nor is it cultural borrowing. It is recognition of an ontological fact. Reality itself unfolds through triadic structure. In Hermetic terms, this is the doctrine of salt, sulfur, and mercury, the fixed, the volatile, and the mediating principle. In Kabbalistic language, it is Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshamah, the vital soul, the spirit, and the divine breath. In Neoplatonic cosmology, it is the hierarchy of matter, psyche, and nous, body, soul, and intellect. These are not three separate systems applied to the same phenomenon. They are three vocabularies describing the same fundamental architecture, that consciousness exists on three simultaneous planes, each requiring its own mode of attention, its own form of work. The lowest register is the embodied soul, what the Kabbalists termed Nefesh and the Hermeticists knew as salt. This is not the physical body itself, but the principle of embodiment, the soul, insofar as it is bound to sensation, instinct, appetite. It is not base or corrupt, it is foundational. Without the proper formation of Nefesh, no higher work is possible. The corruption occurs not in embodiment itself, but in the failure to recognize that embodiment is the first stage, not the final horizon. The middle register is Ruach, the animating spirit, corresponding to sulfur in the alchemical lexicon. This is the domain of psyche in its fullest sense, emotion, imagination, personal will. It is here that most spiritual work occurs, and here that most spiritual work founders. Ruach is the seat of transformation, but also of self-deception. It can imitate assent. It can produce experiences that feel transcendent, but remain enclosed within its own circular motion. The danger of Ruach is not that it is illusory, but that it is real enough to be mistaken for completion. The highest register is Neshamah, the supernal intellect, the mercurial principle that mediates between the human and the divine. This is not consciousness in the ordinary sense. It is the capacity for participation in universal intellect, what the Neoplatonists called nous, and what Hermetic texts describe as the divine mind that thinks through the prepared vessel. Neshamah does not belong to the individual. The individual, through long purification, becomes capable of bearing it. Trinosophy is not the synthesis of these three levels, it is their proper ordering. The adept does not transcend the body, the emotions, or the personal will. The adept establishes each in its rightful place so that the lower serves the middle, and the middle becomes transparent to the higher. This is not hierarchy in the sense of domination, but in the sense of function. Each level performs operations impossible for the others. The disposition required for this work is not faith, but precision. The initiatic path does not reward belief. It rewards exact observation of one's own structure. Silence is cultivated not as virtue, but as methodology. Only in silence does the noise of Ruach subside enough for the movements of Neshamah to become perceptible. Structure is pursued not for its own sake, but because consciousness without structure collapses into sentiment, and doubt is not overcome but employed. Doubt purifies. It removes the accretions of received belief, leaving only what has been verified through inner experience. What the ancient schools understood, and what modernity has forgotten, is that the soul is not waiting to be discovered. It is waiting to be constructed. The movement of consciousness through the trinal structure is not a choice. It is a trajectory inherent to awakening itself. Once the question of the soul's nature is genuinely posed, not as curiosity, but as existential necessity, a sequence of transformations begins that follows its own logic, indifferent to personal preference or pace. The first phase is descent into matter. This is not a fall in the moral sense, but a metabolic necessity. Consciousness, having recognized that it does not know itself, must first become fully embodied. The spiritual traditions that begin with ascetic withdrawal mistake the map for the territory. One cannot transcend what one has not fully inhabited. The descent into Nefesh is the descent into the particular, into this body, this history, this constellation of instincts and appetites. Here the work is somatic and concrete. The practitioner learns to attend to sensation without interpretation, to observe the body's rhythms without imposing narratives upon them. This is not mindfulness in the therapeutic sense, it is the establishment of a ground. The Hermetic axiom holds, that which is below must be known before that which is above can be approached. The body becomes the first text, the first scripture. Its pains and pleasures are not obstacles to transcendence. They are the alphabet in which the soul's condition is written. The confrontation that follows this embodiment is with Ruach, with the emotional and imaginative life that mediates between flesh and spirit. This is the longest and most perilous phase. Ruach is not a problem to be solved, it is a field to be traversed. Here dwell the complexes, the inherited patterns, the unconscious structures that Jung identified as autonomous. The Hermetic tradition understood these not as psychological contents, but as subtle entities. Diamonds in the original Greek sense, neither good nor evil, but possessed of their own will and trajectory. The practitioner learns that the emotional life is not unified. Ruach contains multitudes. What appears as a single self is revealed as a parliament of voices, each claiming authority, each interpreting experience according to its own teleology. The therapeutic approach attempts to harmonize these voices. The initiatic approach observes them until their autonomy becomes undeniable. One does not integrate the shadow by making peace with it. One integrates the shadow by recognizing that shadow is a term for everything in Ruach that operates beneath the threshold of conscious will. This confrontation does not proceed through analysis alone. It requires encounter. The practitioner must submit to the emotional life fully, without the protective distance of interpretation. This is why the initiatic process cannot be conducted solely through reading or intellectual work. Ruach reveals itself only under pressure, in crisis, in longing, in the collapse of familiar meanings. The Neoplatonists spoke of catharsis not as emotional release, but as purification through fire. What is burned away is not the emotions themselves, but the identification with them. As this process deepens, a third movement begins, reorientation. This is not a phase of action, but of suspension. The practitioner has descended into embodiment, confronted the autonomous structures of the psyche, and now stands in a space where neither the body's demands nor the psyche's narratives provide orientation. This is the desert of the initiates, the dark night known to every contemplative tradition. It is not depression, though it may resemble it. It is not nihilism, though meaning has withdrawn. It is the structural necessity of disidentification. Reorientation occurs when the center of gravity shifts from Ruach to Neshamah, from personal will to impersonal intellect. This shift cannot be forced. It can only be prepared for. The practitioner empties the space that Neshamah will occupy. This emptying is not passive. It is active waiting, deliberate receptivity. The Hermetic texts describe this as the creation of the inner vessel, the psyche shaped into a form capable of receiving what descends from above. During this suspension, the practitioner experiences what the Kabbalists called the breaking of the vessels, the collapse of all previous frameworks. What seemed certain becomes questionable. What seemed meaningful becomes arbitrary. This is not philosophical skepticism. It is ontological disorientation. The ground gives way. And yet this groundlessness is not pathology. It is the necessary prelude to the ascent. The ascent begins not with new knowledge, but with new perception. The same world that appeared opaque now reveals its transparency. The same experiences that seemed random now display their pattern. This is not because the world has changed, but because the organ of perception has been transformed. Neshamah awakens not as a voice or a vision, but as a mode of knowing, direct, non-discursive, free from the mediation of emotion or image. In this state, the practitioner recognizes that what was called I is an assemblage, not an essence. The sense of personal identity, which seemed self-evident, is revealed as a function, useful, necessary, but not foundational. Beneath it, or rather above it, operates an impersonal awareness that was always present but never noticed. This awareness is not detached. It is intimately engaged with the world, but its engagement is free from the compulsion of personal desire. The final movement is integration, not in the sense of adding new elements, but in the sense of establishing right relation among the three levels. Nefesh continues to feel, Ruach continues to imagine, but both are now in service to Neshamah. The body remains mortal, the emotions remain responsive, but neither dictates the trajectory of consciousness. The adept does not cease to be human. The adept becomes human in the fullest sense, matter informed by spirit, spirit embodied in matter, and psyche transparent to both. There is a moment in every authentic initiatic process that appears from the outside as collapse. From the inside, it is experienced as the suspension of all reference points. The texts of late antiquity do not sentimentalize this moment. The Gnostic Gospels speak of the soul's descent through the archontic spheres, each of which strips away a faculty, a certainty, a mode of knowing. The Neoplatonic schools required the student to pass through aporia, the state of being without passage, without way forward. The Kabbalistic tradition names it as the crossing of the abyss, the gulf between the personal and the transpersonal that cannot be bridged by will or effort. This is not a metaphor for psychological difficulty. It is a precise description of a structural necessity. The transition from Ruach to Neshamah cannot occur continuously. There must be a break, a rupture, a moment when the old center dissolves before the new center has formed. In this interval, the practitioner exists without ground. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that it can be mistaken for pathology. The symptoms resemble depression, loss of meaning, inability to engage with previous interests, a sense that all effort is futile. But the etiology is opposite. Depression is the result of blocked vitality, of life force turned against itself. The initiatic crisis is the result of successful disidentification. The psyche has loosened its grip on its former objects, but has not yet recognized what lies beyond them. The crucial distinction lies in teleology. Pathological breakdown moves toward fragmentation. Initiatic crisis moves toward integration at a higher level. The practitioner in the abyss has not lost function. The practitioner has lost the illusion that function is identity. The capacity to work, to relate, to act remains. But the sense that these activities constitute the meaning of existence has vanished. During this suspension, the most profound temptation is to retreat. The psyche, confronted with groundlessness, generates new narratives to restore familiarity. It produces spiritual experiences, mystical visions, feelings of unity or transcendence, all of which are Ruach's attempt to fill the void that Neshamah requires. The adept learns to recognize these productions for what they are, the psyche's immune response to its own dissolution. The texts are unanimous on this point. Do nothing. Do not attempt to restore meaning. Do not seek new teachings. Do not fill the silence with practice. The Hermetic admonition is stark. Be still and know. Not stillness as preparation for knowledge, but stillness as the condition in which knowledge arises of itself. The Kabbalistic teaching is equally clear. The abyss cannot be crossed. It can only be endured until the crossing occurs on its own. This is not passivity. It is an active not doing, a vigilant waiting. The practitioner maintains the basic structures of life, embodiment, relationship, work, but without investment in their existential significance. This is what the Buddhist traditions term bare attention, but the Hermetic understanding is more precise. The practitioner is not observing experience. The practitioner is becoming the space in which experience occurs. The dissolution of the former center is accompanied by a silence that is not absence, but presence of a different order. Thoughts continue, emotions continue, but they are recognized as phenomena, not as self. This recognition is not intellectual. It is immediate, non-conceptual, and irreversible once established. The practitioner sees that what was taken to be I is a process, not an entity. A flowing together of sensations, memories, and interpretations that cohere into the illusion of unity. Without this suspension, without this interval of groundlessness, the ascent to Neshamah would be merely imaginative. Ruach would construct an image of transcendence and mistake it for the reality. The abyss exists precisely to prevent this substitution. It is the trial by fire that burns away every representation, every concept, every teaching, until what remains is not knowledge about consciousness, but consciousness knowing itself directly. The reorientation that follows is not a decision. It is a discovery. The practitioner, having ceased to identify with Ruach, discovers that awareness itself has not ceased. Something continues to witness, to know, to be present, but it is not personal. It precedes the personal. It is the ground from which the personal emerges and to which it returns. The Neoplatonists called this the One, the Kabbalists, Ein Sof, the Hermeticists, the Divine Mind. But these are names given afterward. In the moment of reorientation, there are no names. There is only recognition. The emergence from the abyss does not bring illumination in the sense of blinding light or transcendent joy. It brings alignment. The practitioner returns to the world with the same body, the same psyche, the same circumstances, but the relation to all of these has fundamentally altered. What was opaque has become transparent. What was obstacle has become instrument. Integration is not the addition of Neshamah to an unchanged structure. It is the reorganization of the entire human system around a new center. Nefesh, the embodied soul, no longer seeks satisfaction in sensation alone. It becomes the instrument through which Neshamah engages with matter. The body is no longer a prison or a temptation. It is the necessary medium through which the higher must operate in the world of form. Physical health, vitality, and presence are cultivated not for their own sake, but as conditions for the work that now demands expression. Ruach, the psyche, undergoes the most dramatic transformation. The emotions do not disappear, the imagination does not cease, but they are no longer autonomous. They are recognized as functions, not as authorities. The adept feels anger, but is not moved by anger. The adept experiences desire, but is not compelled by desire. This is not repression. It is the establishment of hierarchy, not the domination of the lower by the higher, but the proper subordination of function to purpose. The imagination, which formerly produced fantasies of spiritual achievement, now becomes the faculty through which Neshamah translates its insights into forms communicable to others. The Hermetic doctrine teaches that Ruach is the mirror in which the divine light is reflected downward into matter, but a distorted mirror produces distorted images. The work of integration is the polishing of this mirror, the removal of every smudge of personal desire, every warping of egoic investment, until Ruach reflects without distortion. The result is not sainthood, it is functionality. The adept is not morally superior to others. The adept is structurally aligned in a way that most are not. This alignment manifests as restraint rather than expression. The compulsion to speak, to teach, to demonstrate understanding, all of these diminish. What emerges is a quiet authority that does not announce itself, that does not require recognition, that acts only when action serves necessity. The reascent is not a return to transcendence. It is the discovery that transcendence and immanence are not opposed. Neshamah does not dwell in some heaven apart from the world. It dwells at the center of every moment, every encounter, every object, but it is invisible to those who remain identified with Ruach. The adept has not gone elsewhere. The adept has become capable of seeing what was always present. This seeing does not produce certainty in the dogmatic sense. It produces clarity. The adept knows what must be done, not because external law dictates it, but because the structure of reality itself reveals its demands. Ethics ceases to be obedience to principle and becomes responsiveness to what the moment requires. This is not relativism. It is precision. Action calibrated exactly to the situation, free from both the rigidity of rule and the arbitrariness of impulse. The final state is not rest. It is a new kind of work. The body must be maintained, the psyche must be supervised, and Neshamah must be given the conditions in which it can operate without obstruction. This is the building of the inner temple, not a structure of stone, but a structure of attention, discipline, and alignment. It is never completed. It requires constant vigilance, constant adjustment, constant renewal. What has changed is not the content of life, but its meaning. The adept does not escape suffering or transcend limitation. The adept bears suffering without being destroyed by it, and works within limitation without being defined by it. The former life, with its cycle of desire and frustration, has not been left behind. It has been subsumed into a larger pattern that renders it intelligible. The integration is complete when the practitioner can move fluidly between levels, engaging the body when embodiment is required, engaging the psyche when imagination or emotion serves the work, and resting in Neshamah when direct knowing is needed. There is no longer a split between the spiritual and the mundane. Every act, however ordinary, becomes a site where the higher meets the lower. Every moment becomes an opportunity for alignment. This is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of work that can only commence once the preliminary structures are in place. The adept has not achieved perfection. The adept has achieved functionality, the capacity to serve as a conscious instrument of forces that most humans remain unconscious of. This service is not selfless in the sentimental sense. It is selfless in the structural sense. The personal self has been displaced from the center, and what acts through the adept is no longer reducible to personal will. What is not ordered within the soul cannot receive the order that descends from beyond it.